Hello there. The pro-EU lobby in the UK has found another straw to clasp to their chests regarding their loss of the 2016 EU referendum. It was the Russians what done it. Firstly, please subscribe and like this video to give my channel a boost. And I'm always uploading new content, so please do check back daily. The pro-EU Remainers in the UK have been waiting with bated breath for the Russia report to be published so that they could point to it and call sham on the result of the EU referendum. And even though the report says no evidence of Russian involvement was actually found, the Remainers have still pointed at some vague parts of the report and said, there it is, there's the proof, stop everything, stop Brexit now, have another referendum, etc, etc, etc. And today in Prime Minister's Questions, the Labour leader used his Leader of the Opposition questions to try and pin Boris Johnson down with it. But the Prime Minister just came back and said that the only reason it was being brought up by him was because of Brexit. And neither Keir Starmer nor another Labour MP, Ben Bradshaw, could actually point to any proof in the report that Russia had actually done anything, let alone any hint of collusion between the Leave campaigners and Russian money that other Remainers continually make. And the Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas Symonds then asked an emergency question straight after PMQs on the Russia report. And much of the ensuing debate on the Labour and SNP side revolved around getting an urgent report into the EU referendum and Russian interference. So be in no doubt that's what all the storm is about, trying to derail Brexit even at this late stage after we've actually legally left the bloc. All very tiresome indeed. But during the exchange, the Minister of State for Security, James Brokenshire, did say that there was no need to hold an inquiry because normal UK intelligence procedures would have flagged up any problem at the time. So he seems to be saying that nothing happened. And I do have to point out that the report says exactly that. And need I even bother mentioning the £9 million David Cameron leaflet, or the back of the queue for trade deal comment by President Obama while he was over here on a visit, or that Remain hugely outspent leave? Now those episodes actually had a lot more potential for skewing an election or referendum than any Russian interference, didn't they? So what did the report actually say on the Brexit referendum? But first, who actually wrote the report? Well, it was put together under the last government by the Intelligence and Security Committee, the ISC, which is a cross-party statutory committee whose 9 members are drawn from both houses of Parliament. Currently that's 7 MPs and 2 members from the House of Lords, Dame Diana Johnson and Lord Admiral West. And this is the committee that Boris Johnson tried, but failed, to lever Chris Grayling into the post of chairman. And Boris took it very hard when he failed and removed the party whip from the new chairman, now ex-Tory, MP Dr Julian Lewis. More on that later. Also bear in mind that Boris has already nominated his own national security advisor, our Brexit negotiator David Frost. The ISC is also the committee that oversees the Joint Intelligence Committee of experts that is run from the Cabinet Office. Also bear in mind that Julian Lewis supported leaving the EU in the run-up to the referendum. And in the debate about whether or not to vote to trigger Article 50, he simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my opinion, the people have decided, and I'm going to vote accordingly." Now, the Russia report is very wide-ranging and made a strong case that the UK is vulnerable to outside influence where Russia is concerned. But on the specific topic of the Brexit referendum, It said, and some of this is redacted by the authorities, and those parts are marked with stars. There have been widespread public allegations that Russia sought to influence the 2016 referendum on the UK's membership of the EU. The impact of any such attempts would be difficult, if not impossible, to assess, and we have not sought to do so. However, it is important to establish whether a hostile state took deliberate action with the aim of influencing a UK democratic process, irrespective of whether it was successful or not. Open source studies have pointed to the preponderance of pro-Brexit or anti-EU stories on RT and Sputnik, and the use of bots and trolls as evidence of Russian attempts to influence the process. We have sought to establish whether there is secret intelligence which supported or built on these studies. In response to our request for written evidence at the outset of the inquiry, MI5 initially provided just 6 lines of text. It stated that, and that starred out and redacted, before referring to academic studies. This was noteworthy in terms of the way it was couched. More redaction, and the reference to open source studies. More redaction. The brevity was also to us, again, indicative of the extreme caution amongst the intelligence and security agencies at the thought that they might have any role in relation to the UK's democratic processes, and particularly one as contentious as the EU referendum. We repeat that this attitude is illogical. This is about the protection of the process and mechanism from hostile state interference, which should fall to our intelligence and security agencies. But the report does point out that the statutory role of MI5, the body tasked with internal UK security, contains the following responsibility: the protection of national security and, in particular, its protection against threats from espionage, terrorism and sabotage, from the activities of agents of foreign powers and from actions intended to overthrow or undermine parliamentary democracy. That sounds pretty clear to me. Anyway, the report goes on to say that no one seems to have been aware of the types of threat that Russia posed. And it says, it was only when Russia completed a hack and leak operation against the Democratic National Committee in the US, with the stolen emails being made public a month after the EU referendum, that it appears that the government belatedly realised the level of threat which Russia could pose in this area. Given that the risk thresholds in the Kremlin had clearly shifted, describing the US hack and leak as a game changer, and admitting that prior to what we saw in the States, Russian interference wasn't generally understood as a big threat to electoral processes. And it refers to a Joint Intelligence Committee key judgment, which appears to be redacted, and it said of it, had the relevant parts of the intelligence community conducted a similar threat assessment prior to the referendum, it is inconceivable that they would not have reached the same conclusion as to Russian intent, which might then have led them to take action to protect the process. And then it says, the written evidence provided to us appeared to suggest that Her Majesty's government had not seen or sought evidence of successful interference in UK democratic processes or any activity that has had a material impact on an election, for example, influencing results. And it goes on to say that the studies of attempts to influence the referendum by using RT and Sputnik and social media were not taken fully into account. Now, who watches RT and who watches Sputnik? And it was the older voters who opted for Leave, the very demographic that is less likely to use social media. Anyway, the upshot is that there is no smoking gun for Russian interference in the EU referendum, and also that there was no indication that anything was seriously wrong, apart from in the USA. Nothing other than an assertion in the report that the Russians must have been up to something, And that is the straw that the Remainers have all latched so fiercely onto, along with all their screeching for another referendum, etc. And the report says someone somewhere should have done or should be doing something. Now I'll ask you, had there been any thought in the heads of MPs, Lords and the civil service hierarchy in the lead up to the referendum that the Russians might be about to upset their EU apple cart, which they saw was going the way of Remain anyway? Do you not think that they would have acted swiftly and decisively to deal with any danger to that? You can bet they would. They'd have been all over it just like a rash. No one saw it as a credible problem at the time, is the truth. Now, the report points fingers at all sorts of other organisations for failure to protect our democracy, from the Electoral Commission to MI5. But I find that a bit rich. And why? Because, as I've already pointed out, MI5 has a clear duty here. But obviously, so does the security and intelligence body that oversees MI5. And now I'll read out the remit of the very committee that wrote this report, the Intelligence and Security Committee, the ISC itself. Under the Justice and Security Act 2013 and the accompanying Memorandum of Understanding, the ISC oversees the policies, expenditure, administration and operations of MI5, MI6, GCHQ, Defence Intelligence, the Joint Intelligence Organisation, the National Security Secretariat and the Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism. The committee sets its own agenda and work programme, taking evidence from ministers, the heads of the intelligence and security agencies, senior officials, experts and academics as it considers necessary. And it has just committed itself to continuing the work of the previous committee on the 4 following inquiries. An inquiry into national security issues relating to China, an inquiry into right-wing terrorism, an examination of the current threat from Northern Ireland-related terrorism, and a case study on GCHQ procurement. Now, given that the report from this committee says that it is important to establish whether a hostile state took deliberate action with the aim of influencing a UK democratic process, irrespective of whether it was successful or not, and that this committee oversees all intelligence work and sets its own agenda, etc., then why did it choose not to conduct its own inquiry into the threats to UK democracy? Because, as the report said, the impact of any such attempts would be difficult, if not impossible, to assess, and we have not sought to do so. What are we to make of that? That inquiries should be held by someone and reports made that will end up with no conclusions? And the very body that assesses these things and makes reports to the Prime Minister and Parliament thinks that protecting democracy is someone else's job? Or is this just a way to deflect attention and scrutiny away from that committee, for its own failings to ensure MI5 was fulfilling its remit with regard to protecting our democracy? And I also see no indication of claims by the committee of it being blocked by ministers in setting up such an inquiry of its own, which I understand the Prime Minister could do. So what we're left with is that no one suspected anything until after the referendum was won by the Leave side. Then there's suddenly a strong feeling that Russia did something. We don't know what or when, and there's no proof of anything, but that we should hold a pointless inquiry anyway. Now remember that the Security Minister James Brokenshire said that he was content that any electoral threat from a foreign power would have been flagged up via the existing intelligence channels. But that is not what the ISC is saying, is it? Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, our intelligence and security people should be assuming that certain foreign powers are out to do us down in any way they can and act accordingly. And the Russians should certainly be at or near the top of any list like that. And further, If we've got no proof, then we've got nothing to report on, have we? Now finally, during the emergency question this afternoon, the new chairman of the ISC, the ex-Tory Julian Lewis, asked the Security Minister James Brokenshire to confirm that no special advisor would be let anywhere near his committee. He sounded very precious about it. No doubt a reference to Dominic Cummings and the roving defence and security brief he is currently engaged in. To which he did not get the resounding confirmation he was looking for. That leads me to think that there may be wholesale root and branch reform of the entire security, intelligence and defence setup on the way, and that there's some rearguard defensive actions taking place, and that keeping the Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings influence away from the ISC chairmanship was part of that defensive ploy. Anyway, if you want to hear more from me, please don't forget to subscribe and also press that little bell, or you won't get any notifications. And if you want to see more of me, buy a mug with my mug on it. So what do you think about all of this? Please share and comment, and thank you for watching.